Russian Wagner mercenary leader Yevgeny Prigozhin released an angry video message directed at the Russian military leadership regarding ammunition shortages in Bakhmut. Even though the Russians control over 90% of the city, if they do not finish the battle in the next couple of days, they might not ever capture Bakhmut. According to media reports, Ukraine is inching closer to an offensive that could take place on multiple sections of the front line. So I'm going to go through the different sections of the front line for you, discuss the general picture there, and talk about what the Ukrainian offensive might look like and what the Russian response might be. Thank you for joining. This is the War Report by New World Economics with the 5th of May 2023 frontline report for the Russo-Ukrainian War. Happy Cinco de Mayo to all my friends celebrating it today, and happy late May the 4th to my Star Wars crowd. May the 4th be with you. Before we get started, please consider hitting both that like and subscribe button. Remember, totally free for you, but a giant help for me to grow the channel. Also consider hitting that bell icon so you do not miss any updates. And just a quick housekeeping topic for the channel. As some of you guys may know, we are coming up on a 1-year anniversary of the channel. And as you may also know, we've made a lot of changes recently to help revive the channel, and there are still a lot more coming. I would like to thank all of the new subscribers we have over the last 2 months. There are a lot of you, and I am glad you are here. Also, a huge thanks to those of you who have donated through Super Chat. As you know, a lot of work goes into making these videos, so even a dollar here or there of support, it really means a lot. So thank you. On that note, I have read some of the feedback, and I know there are a lot of you that would like for me to return to daily updates. I hear you, and I have a plan to do so. As you know, these updates take a lot of time, and I do also have a 9-to-5 job. So in order to fund this content creation and all the work that's going into it, I'm reaching out to some friends to help me with the channel, as well as searching for potential sponsorships. And I know some of you guys probably see this as me selling out, but keep in mind, this is the reason for posting this content on YouTube. This is stuff that I want to make. A lot of time goes into making it. We put it on YouTube and we make a little bit of ad revenue that pays back the time. So don't see this as me forcing anything on you. Of course, you can always skip through my videos, but this way, if it's a product you think you might be interested in anyways, maybe I could, get you a little discount or something, and you'll be clicking on my link rather than someone else's. So, I feel like this is pretty standard for most YouTube channels, but it's something we haven't done on this channel yet, so it's a big change. I feel like it's fair to notify you guys. So once again, thank you to those of you that are doing super chats, and thank you for sticking with the channel. So one of the factors that has moved me to every other day videos is script writing. So on the off days, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to speak more openly. So in this update, I'm just going to gloss over the status of the various front lines and discuss the possibilities for Ukraine and their coming offensive. So first, I want to start real quick with the situation in Bakhmut. There's a lot going on here, and most of it is going to be in tomorrow's video update, so I apologize for that, but make sure you're looking out for it. So in terms of like what's recently happened and what's relevant to our discussion today with the Ukrainian offensive, 90% of Bakhmut is under Russian control, perhaps maybe a little bit more than 90%. There have been some recent counterattacks by Ukraine in town, possibly making some gains, but in terms of mapping, we have no evidence that they have. In fact, in the last update we discussed, there's evidence that the Russians have actually gained more ground. Currently, there was some huge event going on in Bakhmut. There's video footage out that I will be showing you guys tomorrow of bombardment of Bakhmut over town, and it's honestly like my jaw dropped when I saw this. So I think we're going to get a big update with things that are going on inside of the town tomorrow. That's kind of why I'm holding off on all this, because we don't really have any concrete information. But talking about Prigozhin and what's going on there. So, Prigozhin, obviously the leader of the Wagner mercenary group, he is kind of, I mean, definitely a controversial figure. Those of you that support Ukraine seem to think he's an idiot, just like a lot of Russian officials. My opinion is that he's not. He's more like a politician. He's not saying things that aren't calculated. And he just recently released this video where, supposedly this is after Ukraine launched a counterattack inside a town. Around 100 of his mercenaries were killed, and these are top tier, very effective frontline combat troops. And supposedly he's really pissed off about it. He made a video cussing out the Russian high command, saying that this could have been prevented if they'd gotten ammo and support from the Russian army. And then he released another video the next day claiming that the Wagner mercenaries would be withdrawing from Bakhmut after the 10th of May. Now, why the 10th of May? Because May 9th is Victory Day, Russian Victory Day, and it's the holiday that they celebrate for their victory over Nazi Germany in World War II. So it's actually like one of the biggest holidays in Russia. Of course, World War II was far more traumatizing for the Russian world than it was any other country, right? So, he's not going to pull out before that. And honestly, here's my opinion on it. I think it's a bluff, or a very not necessarily a very elaborate misinformation operation, or I hate the word misinformation, but it's a deception operation in my point of view. I think that these kind of public statements, I mean, the Wagner mercenaries are getting paid by the Russian military. They're part of the Russian military. When I talk about gains made by Wagner mercenaries in Bakhmut, there's a reason why I say these are Russian military gains inside of Bakhmut, because they're a hired group working for the military. If there's contractors in Afghanistan or Iraq guarding convoys for the U.S., as long as they're getting paid by the U.S. Army, I would still consider them to be U.S. forces, right? So I consider Wagner troops to be Russian forces. So, these guys, they're not going to leave Bakhmut unless it's approved by the command. They're getting paid to be there. So, I'd say that all of that is probably BS. And if they do end up leaving, I'm not saying that they are or are not going to leave town on the 10th, but if they do, it's probably because they're going, the Russian army intends to use them somewhere else on the front. The other bit of skepticism I have about this is I do think that over the next couple days, it's May the 5th right now, so in the next 5 days, I think there's going to be an extremely hard push by Russian forces in the area to try and finish off and capture Bakhmut, especially in the next 4 days before Victory Day. I think obviously it would be huge symbolism for the Russian army, and this is something, of course, the Ukrainians are going to be looking out for, and it might be happening as we speak. I have no idea. We don't have really any updates on this, but you know, nevertheless, I think that that's the intent, is probably to finish off the situation before Victory Day. Anytime after that, and it gets pretty sketchy. From Prigozhin's own statements that he's been saying over the last couple months, is the Ukrainians are building up forces in the area. There's a more Ukrainian troops in the areas around Bakhmut, Konstantinivka, Druzhba, Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Seversk. There's more troops in these areas than the Ukrainians need for the defense of Bakhmut, right? Like, you can only fit so many troops on the front line. They have a ton of reserves in the area. They're probably going to be used for offensive operations. So they haven't been able to use them to reverse the situation, primarily because Ukraine's ways into the city are, muddy and subject to the weather conditions. As summer approaches, those back roads, those trails, those fields, they start to dry up, and it becomes a lot more possible for Ukraine to move stuff into town. So there's a chance that if Russia doesn't capture Bakhmut in the next couple days, Ukraine can potentially stabilize the situation and continue this battle for months, almost indefinitely, depending on how many reserves they have, which is not good for the Russian army and the Russian image, right? So the Russians are going to want to finish this thing off in the next couple of days. Um, and that brings me to the next topic, and that is what's going on in the various front lines. So, with that being said, we're going to move on and talk about the entire front and then close out talking about what a Ukrainian offensive might look like. So, first, we're going to start in the far north around Kupiansk, and I'm just going to try to roll through these and I'm going to talk about them overall. But in terms of this area, there's not a lot of benefit for Ukraine going on the offensive in this area. There's no immediate gains like I don't buy this shit about Ukraine assaulting into the to the Belgorod region of Russia, using it as some kind of bargaining chip. Ukraine's stated goal has been to recapture their own land. So I don't think this is going to happen. In fact, I think it's the opposite. I think this is an area where Russia actually has an opportunity to put a lot of pressure on Ukraine. There's some evidence that Ukraine has been trying to build up their defenses in the Kupiansk region. So I think this region, I'm going to mark it as red as being a concern for Ukraine, where Russia might conduct potential offensive operations during the summer campaign. Next is the area from Svatova down to Kreminna. In terms of this area, obviously this is a huge vulnerability for Russia. For Russia to go on the attack here, all they're doing in that is making themselves more secure in the Svatova area. It doesn't do a lot to harm the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have some strategic depth on their side. However, should the Ukrainians cross into this area, capture Svatova, it would drastically reduce the supply situation for Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. So this is an area that should be big concern for the Russians for potential Ukrainian offensive operations. Now, in terms of Kreminna itself and the forests around it, honestly, I probably had a bad read on this. This area is a freaking bloody stalemate. There is a lot of Russian troops stationed in the area. I had assumed it was probably for some kind of counterattack. What was more likely is these troops are being stationed in the Kreminna Rubizhny area in order to transfer them rapidly between either the Svatova front or the Seversk front should an operation happen. This is a nice central location, these areas of Kreminna, and in the rear here, there's just a central location to distribute troops for the entire northern Donbass operation for the Russians. I don't think the Russians are planning on a large offensive through the forests. Both sides appear to be struggling big time making advances through this forested area. So this area, I just mark it as bloody stalemate, not likely to be big offensive operations in this area. For the area of Bilogorovka, I have this marked as a potential concern for the Ukrainians. The main reason being is I don't see a Ukrainian attack from this direction, specifically from this direction, being successful towards Lysychansk. The Russians can, like I said, with keeping the reserves in this area, they can just respond to it way too quickly. However, these areas of Verkhono-Kamyanskaya, Bilogorovka, the Russians have successfully occupied them before in this war. Once they put the resources to it, I think they could do it again, and it would put a lot of pressure on any kind of Ukrainian counteroffensive going on in the Bakhmut area, which we're about to get to. So I think this is an area of concern for the Ukrainians. Now, in terms of further to the south, though, we'll call this, I guess, the Soledar flank, covering some of these areas like Sporne, Rozdolovka, Yakovlivka, Soledar. I think this area is a huge concern for the Russians. Of course, if the Ukrainians make an attack in this direction and somehow recapture Soledar, the whole dynamic of Bakhmut would change instantly. First of all of these large advances the Russians have made up Highway E40, those they would probably be forced to retract almost immediately. Those positions would be overextended, and Bakhmut would probably turn into a defensive battle for the Russians at that point. So, I'm not saying that this is an area that Ukraine is likely to succeed. I'm saying that this is an area that's a big threat for the Russian side. So it's an area of concern for them. And south of Bakhmut, I view it as being roughly the same, a little bit less so, just because I think Russian logistics would be better in this area. Of course, you have the large Russian town of what are we talking here? This is Gorlovka. I'm sorry, Gorlovka, which is a huge metro area to the south of Bakhmut. I think Russians can get in supplies and reinforcements to this area probably pretty quickly, but nevertheless, for the Ukrainians to put stress on this area at the same time they're putting stress towards Soledar, it would definitely affect the battle. So I think this is an area also of concern for the Russian side. Now moving down to Avdiivka. There's no other way to say this than to say that this area is definitely a huge concern for the Ukrainians for Russian offensive actions. The Russians have built pretty strong flanks both to the north and south of town. They occupy these small towns, which are pretty good defensive positions. Krasnogorovka, Novo Bakhmutovka. At the same time, Vadyan, Pesky, Opitny, the Ukrainians have counterattacked in all these locations many times, it seems without any effect. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian position in Avdiivka is basically in a semi-encirclement. So the Russians have strong positions on the northern southern flanks, while the Ukrainians essentially in semi-encirclement. So it's going to be tough for the Ukrainians to retake ground on the flanks, while it's going to be easier for the Russians to make the encirclement worse for the Ukrainians. This is definitely a big area of concern for Ukraine going into the summer conflict. Now, the area from pesky Pervomaysk all the way down to Marinka, this is just a bloody stalemate, which, in my opinion, serves neither side any benefit to conduct serious offensive operations here. Now, of course, for the Russians to force the Ukrainians the rest of the way out of Marinka or Pervomaysk, there's some benefit to that. I'm not mentioning that because those are battles that are already ongoing. It could force the Ukrainians further back from Donetsk to reduce that shelling. But the battle for Krasnogorovka hasn't even started yet, right? And that's where a lot of the shelling of Donetsk is coming from. You see how long these battles for Pervomaysk and Marinka have taken. The Russians and the Ukrainians, they have so much material and personnel that is intended for this summer conflict. I just think it would be a waste to send so much of it to death and destruction in this part of the battlefield. For the Russians to capture this area, the Ukrainians have a fallback line. Nedilove, Karlovka, Hernik. Not to mention, on top of the fact that they have all these built up urban areas to fall back to, they also have a string of lakes and rivers to use as defensive fortifications too. So there's a limit to how far Russia can go in this direction. Also for the Ukrainians, they can push deeper into the Donetsk area, but it's very rural. They're not going to make it very far. So bloody stalemate. As for the Vuhledar direction, this is a huge concern for the Russians. There's a big reason why they wanted to capture this area for the winter. That way the Ukrainians couldn't use it against them when summer came. They failed in that aspect. So the Ukrainians, you can't see it on this map, but we'll look at it in a minute. But, if they launch a big attack in this direction, they have some success in Pavlovka and Mikelsky, then they can push on to Volnovaka and potentially on to Mariupol, which would be a huge blow to Russian morale. So this is a bad section of the front for an offensive that happened for the Russians. Opposite situation in terms of Velilka, Novosilka. I think that this area is a big problem for the Ukrainians. The Russians have a bit of a salient here that the Ukrainians haven't really managed to push back any. From a geographical perspective, the way I'm looking at the roads here, the road connections kind of serve to the Russian benefit a bit better. For the Ukrainians, it seems like there's probably more stress on their logistics in this area. On top of that, if Russia were to launch some kind of counterattack on Volokanovosilka at the same time Ukraine is attacking on Vuhledar, that could ruin prospects of an offensive operation for Ukraine in that direction, and even potentially in the Zaporozhye direction, which we're going to look at. So this is, not a likely area of um, offensive for Ukraine, but maybe it's that one's a little more iffy. In terms of this southern front, the Zaporozhye front, this entire area is a big problem for the Russians. Goliaipol to Pologi to Rekiv, Vasilivka, Kamyanska, even down to Tokmak. And this is going to be the main topic of Ukraine's potential counteroffensive operations. So, looking overall at the entire frontline area, as you can see, the red areas I think are areas that we're potentially going to see Russian offensive actions, whereas the blue areas are where we're potentially going to see Ukrainian offensive actions, or the areas that you would get your most bang for your buck. So now I'm going to tell you, kind of break down just from like a more overhead perspective what we're looking at here in terms of the Ukrainians attacking in this direction towards Svatova, obviously cutting this big road here, reducing the amount of supplies going to Severodonetsk. This is a big problem here. This would also solve the Kremenna forest issue and potentially take a lot of stress off of Bakhmut as well. In terms of Bakhmut, some of you guys might have seen something like this, but people seem to think that the Ukrainians are going to surround it in a pincer. I don't think that that's going to happen or would be such an easy task, right? But it would change the dynamic of the battle from offensive on the Russian side to defensive on the Russian side, which for the Ukrainians could be a victory in its own. Now, the main thing we want to talk about, though, is like potentially to the south here. Mariupol is a big target, and Melitopol is a big target. These are two locations where the Ukrainians can cut this land bridge, right, and prevent the Russians from having land access to Crimea. After that land bridge is cut, the only access is down here across the Kerch Strait. And as we've seen, the Ukrainians have already taken out that bridge once with a bomb. It's now fully operating, both road and rail crossings. But should the Ukrainians retake this land bridge, that would present a huge problem for the Russians, potentially allowing HIMARS launchers and things like that, or maybe long-range drones to strike at the Kerch Bridge. So, this is an area we definitely have to talk about. A Ukrainian attack in this area would probably look something like this, trying to strike down at Vasilivka, both on land and by water. As you know, like some of you might have known, Ukraine has received a lot of like riverboat type equipment and landing equipment from the U.S. Nothing that can be used for a large amphibious operation, but definitely enough to conduct special forces amphibious operations for an extensive amount of time. So lower amounts of higher trained troops. So this area is definitely a concern for the Russians. Ukrainian attacks in the directions of Tokmak and Pologi. Once these three locations have been taken, they would want to take the ground in between them, say the roads, and this would give them a logistic advantage in the situation. So once this is secured, they could really push in two different directions. Of course, they can push down to Berdyansk, which I think would be less likely. It's a lot further, and then they're starting to deal with rapid response forces sent from Russia at that point, which could arrive in this area a lot quicker than rapid response forces coming from Crimea. So Russia has what they have in Crimea, but if Russia wanted to send troops from Russia proper to Crimea and up to Melitopol, that's obviously a lot longer distance. So once these three locations are captured, the Ukrainians would want to move down and put pressure on Melitopol, capturing, of course, checkpoints, road crossings, basically in these areas. In this area, mainly to kind of shield the Russians from responding from this direction, of course, capturing some ground beyond Pologi there. But the main targets here is really this circle: Tokmak, Vasilivka, and then Melitopol. And then once they get to Melitopol, as you can see, there is, this is a sound right here. This is like a lagoon. There's no way for the Russians to connect their forces between the two locations from that point. And once Melitopol falls, Ukraine could easily push on to some of these locations like Priazovsky to basically, completely cut that off. I mean, there might be some Russian supply that can move along this narrow beach road here, but it's not going to be a lot. So that's basically what the Ukrainian plan near Melitopol would be. In terms of the rest of the front, I expect that either it's going to go one of two ways. Ukraine's going to launch an offensive somewhere else, like to the north first, to draw Russia's attention away from the south, and then they launch their offensive in the south, or they're going to launch their offensive in the south first, and then after they've drawn the Russian army in, maybe they've had small gains. Maybe Ukraine can capture Pologi, but has a lot of trouble capturing Vasilivka and Tokmak, whatever. At that point, the Russian media is going to be saying, and Russian telegram channels going to be saying, oh, we're inflicting terrible losses on the Ukrainians, similar to the way the Kherson offensive happened, and then boom, surprise attack on the outskirts of Bakhmut, or boom, surprise attack on Svatova. Russia then has to respond to that. Ukraine takes that opportunity to, send their big fist, down through here, death blow and Melitopol. Very similar to what happened between the Kharkov and Kherson counteroffensives. Don't fix what isn't broken. That is what I'm saying here. All right, guys, that is it for me on this one. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you next time.